Is postmodern cultural Marxism a thing? And is it a good description of wokeism? Let's have a cup of tea here in my living room in northeast London and discuss this. But I want to discuss this casually and in reference to a very freshly released video. I've just watched it and enjoyed it very much by Hans-Georg Moeller on his channel, Carefree Wandering. I won't critique the video as a whole because 87% of it is entirely compelling and agreeable to me. I recommend you watch it. I'll attach the link below. But I want to talk about a specific bit of that video where Hans-Georg Moeller points out that Jordan Peterson attaches the label postmodern cultural Marxism to wokeism. And Georg pushes there against Jordan on both counts by saying that wokeism isn't very Marxist at all, but actually it's not very postmodernist either. And what we're chatting about in this video is how Georg is right about the first bit, that wokeism ain't Marxist, but that actually Jordan Peterson is plausibly right about the second bit, that wokeism is indeed a postmodernist sort of thing. And when we say that something is a postmodernist sort of thing, it's important that we differentiate the intellectual thrust of postmodernist ideas and their psychological thrust, because in so many ways postmodernism pulls in opposite directions, and in these two different thrusts contradicts itself. Intellectually it wants to deconstruct the individual, psychologically it wants to make the individual primary. So it's always a conversation beyond just a set of particular ideas. It's a conversation about moments of moment in the culture and different threads that live in us, different ideas that we half subscribe to and sometimes are inclined to forget that we subscribe to them, and so on. So these are always grey-ish conversations. So let's start with the first bit. Is wokeism, which I'm simply not going to define in this video because I'm going to assume you're roughly aware of what sort of thing I'm referring to. And indeed, there are going to be videos on this channel defining it more deeply. And I see wokeism as a kind of extraordinarily perverse inversion of liberalism, like liberalism in reverse. We'll talk about that a great deal. I'm to that extent sympathetic with a label that John Gray in England sometimes uses about woke folks, and he doesn't use the word wokeism actually. He says something like hyper liberal wokeism, and I think that absolutely nails the phenomenon. But let's talk about the Marxist element. Now, why is Jordan Peterson motivated to go there? There are several reasons, but I'm going to name just one. One is that he's compelled by the image he sees before him when he looks at history of how a lot of folks who were big fanciers of the Soviet Union in the middle of the second half of the 20th century became less fancying of the Soviet Union and instead took up some postmodernist ideas, partly giving up what they thought before, partly sellotaping, sticky taping postmodernist ideas to wherever they found themselves previously and trying to make the whole thing sort of hang together. Now, there is a lot of that, and you can observe quite a bit of it in France a few decades ago. In particular, Noam Chomsky regularly talks about this, so it's not just Jordan Peterson. But here's the problem. This is just an account of historical derivation. This is just an account of how, at least in a certain historical context, B has come from A. But so what? I mean, an account of historical derivation doesn't even give us a kind of loose connection through what Wittgenstein called family resemblances. We're going to need more than that. Now, does Peterson himself offer more? A little bit he does. But instead of going there in this casual chat of a video, let's look the other way. Let's look at the palpably obvious counterpoints to this. In other words, bits of Marxism in thought and spirit that are just completely absent from wokeism. And I think on this point, Georg in his video did a very, very good job. So I'm just gonna, as it were, simply elevate one or two of the things he said. I think one thing he said is how palpably absent class was from wokeism. And I think that's absolutely right. And you've got this extraordinary image of, let us say, a black female American who is a postgrad student at Harvard, with the thought being pushed that she is more disadvantaged than a white male who is stuck in the deep interior of the United States in a job in which he is struggling, in an industry which is struggling. Please give me a break, come on. And that's the sort of point that Mark Lilla, who Georg appropriately mentions in his video, just is made over and over and over, the absurdity of that kind of image. Nobody seriously is going to think that the postgrad student at Harvard is more disadvantaged. Interestingly, this is microscopic footnote, I don't think that Georg can be right that Mark thinks that, or Mark thought that identity politics, extreme identity politics and wokeism were on the way out, were over. Not at all. What he thought was over about identity politics was its efficacy. He thought that it was over as anything out of which we might make something good. He thought it was a sort of disastrous escape from political reality, and a very prominent one, and one that was going to remain prominent. It was just going to be over in the sense that it weren't going to get anybody any good political results. But this is a minor point. So class is missing. So many other things are missing. I mean, something else that's missing is a really robust, hard-nosed analysis of social reality that is absolutely central to the spirit of Marxism. That's something that is just completely missing from wokeism. So it's very, very hard. It's very, very hard to attach Marxism to it. I mean, is there anything one could do to make that connection? Anything more? Anything that Jordan Peterson himself doesn't do? It'll be a stretch. I mean, let's try something, I suppose. Marxism tells you that there is a before and after. And it goes with the idea that there's a certain kind of predetermination about what's part of the before and what's part of the after. And it leaves room, let's put this politely, it leaves room for the idea that to bring about the after, it may be right to do lots of things that are less than lovely in the before. I mean, this is a particular idea that was intensified by Lenin. You might say against the spirit of Marx, you might say not against the spirit of Marx, a conversation for another time. So there is this kind of extraordinary distinction between before and after in Marxism. And there is indeed this distinction in wokeism. Because when woke folks walk around trying to cancel people, they're not saying that it's a good world and it's a good, healthy academic department in which we go around canceling our colleagues. No, it's rather that once we bring about the kind of world that we want, or the kind of world that we need, or even in some cases the kind of world that we're going to inevitably converge on, or would inevitably converge on if things went well enough, then we're not going to need to cancel anybody. And the nastiness of the cancellations is going to have no moral weight in the after when we get to it. So it's a little bit like the philosophy of saying, I like my neighbor a lot, I want to be friends with my neighbor, but my neighbor has this friend that he's always with and I have no sort of place to insert myself. Why don't I take my neighbor's friend and throw them in the ditch? And then say, listen, I'm here now. I know your neighbor is in the ditch now, and it happens that I threw him there. But surely if we start a new friendship together, you and I, we can sort of disregard how the space for this friendship was created because it was before and after and not connected. Now, the problem with this distinction before and after is it's actually generic. I mean, you see it in nihilism, 19th century Russian nihilism. You see it in fundamentalist religious violence, where we can have a bloodbath to create a limitlessly pure world. And indeed, you see it on the right and not only on the left. Because if you look at the storming of the Capitol again in the United States on the 4th of January, I think it was, these were not people who were saying this is a good thing to do. These were people who were saying that under extreme circumstances, this is the sort of thing that we just have to do. And once we have our country back, we're not going to have to do this. And so this sort of before and after distinction, the distinction between what's to come that will be sort of insulated from what's here, such that the mess of now will not impact the purity of later. That's a generic distinction, and you're just not going to nail it on to work as much. We could talk about this for several more hours, but basically, this is the thing that I'm inviting you to be persuaded of. It's really hard to attach Marxism onto wokeism, and the main move Jordan makes here is a move of historical derivation, which for me is a limited move, or indeed not a move at all. But I am sympathetic to Jordan, very sympathetic with Jordan, on the thought that postmodernism must be central to wokeism. And here I'm going to push against Georg, but only casually and briefly, because we are going to have systematic conversations about this on different YouTube channels, including on my own. So let's just be casual and warm ourselves up a little bit. Pushed against the wall, what would I say are the two most central ideas that go with postmodernism? I would say the first idea is that thinking it makes it so. That, if I think in a certain way about, let's say, a cryptocurrency, that will affect the cryptocurrency. Because if enough people begin to think about the cryptocurrency in the way that I think about it, and we all talk to one another, that could impact the value of the cryptocurrency. But then there is a further, deeper connection there, and that's that it's only a cryptocurrency because we take it to be a cryptocurrency, or just a currency, the £5 note in my pocket. And so, of course, in so many ways, thinking it does indeed make it so. But that thought that thinking it makes it so appropriately has to stop at a certain point. And postmodernism takes that thought not all the way. I think many postmodernists would say, well, science is science. Science has a certain kind of objective explanation for the convergence that occurs within it. But anyway, that thought that thinking it makes it so just goes too far with postmodernism. I mean, I don't think that what the psychology of a human being is really about thinking it makes it so, because human psychology has a certain level of depth, a certain level of conflictedness. These are universal features of human psychology. There are certain values that are universal, and whatever we think about, they're not going to stop being universal, they're not going to stop having the kind of shape that they do. There are certain things that are just going to be true about what freedom is or what justice is, that are going to be completely independent of what we think about them. They're going to be completely independent of particular power relations and so on. And so this is one thought that really does go with postmodernism as a kind of thing that is typically half thought, actually. What's another thought that goes with postmodernism? Well, I think another thought is that we either have to accept a concept or an idea in its most maximal form, or we've got to reject it. And this is a typical way in which what Jordan with lamentation would say, Enlightenment values are rejected by postmodernists, that they would often elevate a particular Enlightenment idea into its most ambitious shape, and given that it doesn't work in that kind of shape, we've got to give it up altogether. That idea might be some kind of conception of rationality, or some kind of idea of truth or truthfulness. And Aristotle beautifully mocks Plato for this, when he points out in the Nicomachean Ethics, when he discusses Plato's conception of Plato's form of the good, and says that a white thing will not be any more white if it is white for a single day than if it were white for an eternity. And I do think both these ideas are absolutely centrally and sort of ludicrously, explosively part of this moment that is occurring in our culture that we refer to as wokeism. I mean, let's take a personal example. In his video, Geo gave a very good example of wokeism in the academy, various sorts of diversity requirements that become part of the bureaucracy and then begin to infect not just sort of practice within the department, but also even the kind of ideas that you might have or want to publish and so on. Well, sure. Let's take another example. I do a little bit of advocacy in the disability community. And in the course of this, a lot of, let's be frank, Americans have written me private messages saying, look, in the little videos you release on Twitter, the problem with them really is that you assume that disability is a bad thing. But disability is only a bad thing because of prejudices out there in society. If you removed prejudice about disability, disability would disappear. Excuse me? Are you serious? Well, seemingly yes. And so the argument is that, look, Rick might be missing a leg, but in a society where missing a leg were normal, he'd be normal. And in fact, the two-legged person would be abnormal. And of course, this is absolutely farcical, because as soon as you begin asking questions like, could any human being ever want to be limited in certain physical ways such that they can't do things that pretty much any human being wants? You know, could anybody positively wish to be in that kind of predicament? Well, not really. Could anybody positively wish to be in a great deal of physical pain if they could easily choose not to be? You know, could anybody easily wish upon themselves to have the different kinds of burdens of chronic illness, just the physical burdens of it? Well, no. You know, there are certain things, certain evils that human beings want to stay away from. And so, no, you know, I am sorry, but I am going to go on as though having a significant disability, particularly if it involves physical suffering, I'm going to go on saying that that's a problem. And what's so ironic about these people who've written to me is that they themselves find their lives bloody tough because they do have, most of them, legitimate disabilities. And so there's a real sort of alienation and false consciousness going on here. Because on the one hand, they want to be taken seriously that they're really struggling with this issue. On the other hand, they want to say that they're only struggling with this issue because there is prejudice. And in fact, the issue is in objective terms not really an issue at all. It's just a socially constructed problem. Well, sorry. Now, this is a classic example of thinking it makes it so. You also see classic examples of thinking it makes it so, for example, in trans discourse, which is tragic because the most sort of social justice driven, the most persuasive sort of social justice move for the trans community is we're born like this. You know, at the same time, much of the discourse is filled with not we're born like this, but with this whole thing is a social construct and so on. And so that's problematic. And that is the idea of thinking it makes it so. And then, of course, there are many ways in which people are inclined to give up on certain ideas, like truth, like certain conceptions of objectivity. I mean, check out a video on this channel about classical music research, musicology. You know, there have been arguments recently saying that our judgments about whether Beethoven was a great composer and which pieces of his are important is just colored by power relations, such that we can't get beyond power relations to assess the music. And because Beethoven was a white male, our criteria for what's a great work of music is just the sort of thing that a white male does, and there's no way to get round this conundrum. There is, and you do it by reading the score, you do it by having good intuition and good judgment about what's a great contribution to musical language, what's a very moving thing to add to our culture via the means of musical expression. We can do it easily, and there's nothing racist about it. You know, ironically, it's these critiques which say that Beethoven was just an above average composer and that we should, pay attention to him less. These critiques are themselves peculiarly attached to certain strange ideas that actually don't take feminism, for example, seriously enough. Because the problem isn't there are all of these amazing musical texts in Beethoven's age, which are, as it were, just overlooked by us. The problem is that women weren't allowed to develop their talent properly to become great composers in that historical period. And so one of the things that's clearly going on in that kind of quarrel is the idea that either we take the most ambitious conception of truth or the most ambitious conception of rationality of a certain kind of objectivity, or we don't. And since we don't, we've got to throw out of the window altogether the idea that one kind of interpretation can be remotely better than another. Has this been a sort of knockdown, compelling argument tying postmodernism and wokeism? No, but it's the beginning of conversations, and beginnings are something that conversations can't do without. I'm going to hang up my boots for now because it's terribly late, so late that I've been even slurring my words a little bit. But it's been a pleasure to chat with you on this topic. This conversation is to be continued. Keep well, and I'd love you to click the bell or subscribe to this channel if this was interesting, because I'm going to do more conversations of this kind very, very soon. Keep safe and bye-bye.